My name is Jason Ye. I am a reproductive endocrinologist at the Aspire Houston Fertility Institute in Houston, Texas. So there are a lot of medications in the world of fertility treatment. Some of them would include oral medications like clomiphene, also known as Clomid, Femara, which is another one, also known as letrozole. And then beyond that, there are a lot of injectable medications. Many of them go by branded names, things like Gonal-f, Menopur, Follistim, Lupron, Cetrotide, Ganirelix, the list just goes on and on. They're endless. And if anything, more and more drugs are constantly coming to market all the time. I would loosely categorize the medications into two different categories. One category would be medications that are geared towards controlling and stimulating the ovaries as well as the ovulation part and controlling and making sure things don't happen in an untimely way. And then other medications that we use commonly are for supporting an ongoing pregnancy. Clomid or clomiphene is an oral medication that's classified, it's a little fancy name, but it's classified as a selective estrogen receptor modulator, which basically means for the brain sees that as an anti-estrogen. And as a response to that, the brain does all these incredible magical things to pull more follicles or more eggs to ovulate at the same time. So the way I will explain this to a lot of patients is that beginning with ovulation, imagine the body as sort of pulling together a group of eggs or a group of follicles together. And the natural ovulation cycle for a person usually will include one egg to ovulate and then cross the finish line, if you will, every single month. And that's why the natural pregnancies generally are typical single pregnancies, singleton pregnancies. But with these fertility medications, they're going to use sort of a stimulation or hormonal effect to push more of these egg runners, so to speak, across the finish line. And then sometimes we may ovulate 2 follicles or 3 or 4 at a time. With IVF or in vitro fertilization, the objective is typically to get as many as possible. So when we use these injectable medications, sometimes that number can exponentially increase. Sometimes even 10, 20, 30 eggs retrieved can be quite impressive. And I think all fertility doctors might have their unicorn patients where occasionally they see 50 or 60 eggs retrieved. And those are some very, very high responders that sometimes respond very well to fertility medication. In the world of IVF, it sort of is considered, I will describe it to patients as like an upside down pyramid. And so when we've got a very, very high egg count, invariably all those follicles that we puncture and the eggs that come out of them, some of them are mature eggs, some of them are immature eggs, and then from there, they are fertilized individually with 1 sperm each. Most eggs will not make it. And so human fertility is still, in many ways, still kind of a mystery where most eggs don't turn into embryos, most embryos won't implant. And so when you start off with a very, very high number, invariably we don't end up with as many embryos. And then I think one of those modern day magical points with IVF is that when those embryos are actually frozen, those embryos can persist indefinitely. And so when a couple is trying to conceive or a person's trying to conceive, we could do a single embryo thaw and a single embryo transfer. And then from there, we've got extra embryos that are hanging out that we can call back on in a couple of years sometimes. And those embryos go through this sort of this hibernation period where those success rates are often tied to the age of the person when the eggs were actually retrieved. One of the technical difficulties in the early days of IVF was preventing a premature ovulation. And so if you can imagine all these runners running across the finish line, if one person crosses the finish line too early, the entire race is over. And so we actually have different types of medications. Some are called GnRH antagonists, and they basically block the ovulation process. And every day that we use one of these medications, the whole ovulation process is suppressed. And then when the time is right, when the ultrasounds look good, we have one last medication to kind of push everything over the edge and induce an ovulation right before an egg retrieval. There are a list of medications that we use for what we call a trigger. And so ovulation triggers can be used with, or ovulation triggers can be in the form of something called Lupron, also in the form of HCG. And HCG, as many people know, is a pregnancy hormone. And through the magic of human development and human biology, HCG hormones, even though it's not typical in the middle of an ovulation process, it just happens to match the biologic mechanisms of the actual ovulation hormone in humans, which is called the LH, or the luteinizing hormone. And so because those two things are almost like two keys that fit in the same lock, we can utilize the very abundant nature of HCG in the world and use that for our ovulation IVF purposes. Progesterone is a hormone that is necessary to support pregnancies. And so the name progesterone actually comes from this idea that it's a progestational hormone. And you squish all the words together and you get progesterone. And progesterone is necessary, very necessary, in the first 6 to 7 weeks of pregnancy. Typically in IVF, there is no internal source of progesterone, and so the body actually has to be given progesterone from an external source for any of these embryos and pregnancies to stick. And so progesterone, when it's delivered, can be delivered a couple of different ways, but the most common, at least here in the US, is typically with an oil-based injection. And progesterone is actually based off of a cholesterol molecule, so it floats around most easily in oil, and that needs to be delivered through an intramuscular shot, typically through kind of the backside of the body, and I think patients have their own strategies for making sure that's comfortable and tolerated well for them. There are a few misconceptions about fertility medications. One misconception is that a lot of patients find that oral medications are perhaps safer or more natural or more easily tolerated, and then injectable medicines, for whatever reason, there's a stigma against them and patients will say, I don't want that stuff. When in fact, these oral medications are more artificial, and these are true pharmaceutical drugs. Sometimes their half-life or their duration in the body is days to weeks at a time. So when you swallow certain pills, even though they've been around for a long time, it will hang out in your body for days to weeks, which sometimes is a good thing, and in some cases is not a good thing. IVF medications, or at least in the world of ovarian stimulation, some of these medications are actually what we call recombinant medications or ultra-purified medications, and these are truly the same hormones that your body uses on a regular basis. And so we're literally using the signals from the body, and we've replicated them in a lab. And one of the reasons why IVF medications have to be given every day is that they are not long lasting. So they only last a couple of hours. And so when you give them on a day, you have to redose them the next day because of how quick and effective and how natural they are, because that basically is replicating the human process.